Thanks for downloading the McKay interview. Corinne Momal-Vanian is the executive director of the Kofi Annan Foundation and someone who worked with the great man and knew him well. Hello everyone, I'm in Geneva today, very close to the United Nations, and thanks to the easing of public health restrictions, have at last broken free of the confining Zoom and Skype screen, and am able to sit 2 meters apart, of course, from my guest, thank goodness. I'm in the heart of Geneva's UN Quarter, if you know the area, and I'm on the premises of an eponymous foundation started by someone whose name is revered, not just here, but all over the world. A man of astonishing reputation, who very sadly died almost 3 years ago. I'm talking about Kofi Annan, the distinguished Ghanaian diplomat who was United Nations Secretary General from 1997 until 2002. And I'm in the offices of the Kofi Annan Foundation with its executive director, Corinne Momal-Vanian. Corinne, it's good to see you again, and thanks for inviting me here and giving me the chance to break free from my desk.
Welcome, Michael. I'm really happy to welcome you at the foundation because visitors are still quite rare today. So it's great to have someone come and visit. Thank you, Michael.
My pleasure. And listeners, just be aware that you might hear a dove serenading us in the microphone. And I think he or she is sitting outside somewhere. Corinne, we've known each other for quite a few years, and I'm interested to learn more from you about the Kofi Annan Foundation. And I'm sure our listeners are too. But before we start, please let me tell our listeners a little about you, as many tuning in might not be familiar with your name. Before you arrived here, you held many senior positions and worked in a variety of countries for the United Nations, most recently as Director of Conference Management at the UN, offices in Geneva, and Director of Information. You served as Special Assistant to Kofi Annan in 2005 and 2006, traveling with him to some 20 countries. You worked for 6 years in the Executive Office of the Secretary General after serving in 2 regional economic and social commissions of the United Nations in New York. And it all sounds like you had a busy and enjoyable time. On top of that, you also found time to study for a master's degree in business administration from the HEC, the HEC, Graduate School of Management in Paris, and an advanced degree in international relations from Sciences Po in Paris also. And you recently completed an executive certificate in management and leadership at the MIT Sloan School of Management. And vous êtes française. You're also French. Great to be here with you, Corinne. Before we dive into the heart of my questions about the foundation, I have a couple of preliminary ones. Some of our listeners are not part of the Geneva bubble. Some, the majority, I would guess, would have heard of Kofi Annan. Some may not. I even remember some young people abroad, but quite close to me, who 10, 15 years ago or more, to my surprise, had never heard of him. But maybe they were exceptions, I don't know. But he was certainly exceptional and became a brand in his own lifetime, even though he certainly would have eschewed that word. Corinne, why, in your opinion, was he so admired, respected and sought after? You knew him, you observed him close up, you traveled with him. What's your opinion? What are your recollections of the man?
I think you have to talk about the man and you have to talk about the leader. And in both areas, he was exceptional. As a man, he had this grace and class that are really exceptional, really unique. And people were just drawn to him because he had this very, very quiet voice, but with enormous moral authority. And he just remembered absolutely everybody. And he was equally courteous. And I traveled with him and I saw him meeting refugees in Darfur and heads of state in China or Japan. And he was equally courteous and respectful with all. And I think that really drew people to the man. And he was, at the United Nations, of course, he was the only Secretary General that came from the staff. So staff just loved him because we always considered that he was one of us. And as a leader, he had, I think, a unique combination of moral authority and political savviness. So although he stood up for a number of important principles enshrined in the UN Charter, he really knew how to negotiate, and he knew how to discuss various issues, whether it was with Israel, with Iran, with Washington. he had this political sense, which was really very, very strong. So I think it's the combination of of both that made him truly an exceptional leader.
I hadn't realised that he was the only one since it was set up here that came from the staff. So just spend a few minutes explaining where he came from, how he came up then through the organisation. I'm curious to know.
He actually started his UN career in this town in Geneva at the World Health Organization. And then he worked in various functions at UNHCR, at the UN Economic Commission for Africa. But he did a lot of years in New York. And before he was Secretary General, he was in charge of peacekeeping. And his profile, I think, really increased when he was head of peacekeeping during the 90s, at the time when the UN was very busy in peacekeeping operations.
I see, okay. Corinne, I travelled extensively in Africa during the 70s, the 80s and the 90s, though not so much recently, and saw for myself at first hand in those days the complexities of decolonization, independence from the European former imperial powers, ingrained and largely negative and prejudiced attitudes of many Europeans, Americans, and some on the continent of Asia too, towards many things African, made worse, in my opinion, by the considerable ability that too many African countries, or at least some of their so-called big man leaders had and still have, of shooting themselves in their despotic feet. I won't mention names of countries and leaders, but you don't need to be an expert on Africa to divine which so-called leaders have been in power for 15, 20, 25, or even 30 years. Their people deserve better, and they give Africa a bad name, in my view. Though I must say things are much better now. However, and it's a big however, two names stand above this, Mandela and Annan. Though quite different in life experiences and background, why do you think many would put Kofi Annan up there with Nelson Mandela in the deity of great African leaders?
Michael, first, I would just want to say there are many great African leaders, and I just want to cite, for instance, two women, because let's not forget women, Ellen Sirleaf Johnson and Graça Machel. I mean, Graça Machel was actually part of the board of this foundation for a while. But I think Kofi Annan, I think Africans were very proud of the fact that he represented Africa on the global stage, not as the head of African Union, but he showed that Africa had a say in this global organization that the UN is. And to this day, when I meet Africans, including young Africans, because you were discussing name recognition, certainly young Africans, many are aware of his name and very proud. He just made it in an international organization, and that just made them proud. And he had, at the same time, this ability to interact with people from very different cultures. He was completely at ease in New York. He was actually the toast of the town in New York, in some very social circles, as well as in the bush in Africa. And that was remarkable, really.
It's unusual. I should tell the listeners that we're sitting in this very grand sort of boardroom at the foundation, and I'm looking at two wonderful photographs, one of Kofi Annan with Nelson Mandela and the other one of Kofi Annan himself, and they're really very attractive photographs, I have to say. So the great man has passed away. I have to ask you this question. It's an obvious question, but I'm interested to hear how you answer it. What is his legacy, and why does it matter? Why should people care, even though so many of us here in Geneva hold him in high esteem? I mean, why should people more broadly care than just this sort of Geneva bubble that we're talking about?
Well, let's start with the bubble, with the Geneva bubble. For instance, the legacy of Kofi Annan in Geneva is huge. He basically established the Human Rights Council, which is now the most important sort of political multinational body, that multilateral body that meets here. He also instigated the creation of the Global Fund for the eradication of TB, malaria, and HIV/AIDS. So this is one major organization and a very successful one as well, based in Geneva. So his legacy is very concrete and important in Geneva. But more generally, he was also at the origin of the adoption of the Millennium Development Goals, which have been succeeded by the Sustainable Development Goals. this is the actual roadmap for the international community in terms of sustainable development. And I don't think maybe we all realize how important the sustainable development goals are to the work of the international community. He also was the instigator of the International Criminal Court. And I could go on and on with the number of things that he instituted in just the 10 years at the head of the UN. He probably did more than any Secretary General before him or after him, bar maybe Dag Hammarskjöld.
So you're saying that these things started in his time. They
Yes.
weren't sort of in their infancy, but they were initiated from
Absolutely.
those days. Really?
Exactly.
I see. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think, Dag Hammarskjöld who was the second Secretary General of the UN, is often cited because he basically invented peacekeeping, which was not in the UN Charter. But Kofi Annan certainly also expanded the remit of the UN in a way that was not originally in the Charter. And that is a very interesting and impactful to this day.
Thanks, Corinne. My guest today is Corinne Momal-Vanian, Executive Director of the Kofi Annan Foundation in Geneva. And we're talking about the man and the invaluable work done by the foundation. Corinne, let's turn to a specific topic that was very close to Kofi Annan's heart, democracy. You told me before we spoke about this interview that this foundation focuses a lot on this area. My question is this: is democracy really in retreat? And if it is, what can be done? And more to the point of my visit and this interview, what is the Kofi Annan Foundation doing to reinvigorate democracy, and where? And lastly, how? That's the important word, I think, for this conversation. How do you go about doing it? Please give me some examples, because reinvigoration is a powerful word with noble sentiment.
Indeed, indeed. Well, democracy matters, and it mattered enormously to Kofi Annan because he thought that governments must be legitimate and accountable. And this is not a Western idea. I think all over the world, and surveys continue to show it, people aspire to have legitimate and accountable governments. And that's how maybe I would define democracy. And there are many ways to reach this goal. It is in retreat, Michael, unfortunately. And again, many studies show it. Freedom House reports show that many countries have the quality of democracy has decreased in many countries, both in traditional democracies and, older established democracies. And, it's enough to look at what happened in Washington on the 6th of January to understand that democracy is in peril in many places. And in more newly established democracies. One area, for instance, which is of concern is West Africa, which was really a beacon for democracy in the 90s, late 90s, after several civil wars were solved. Unfortunately, in many countries, for instance, we see that presidents do not abide by constitutional term limits. We see that the electoral management bodies are less independent than they used to be. And so what we try to do is act on two main fronts. You want to know the how. One is in addressing squarely the new threats to democracy, and that's in the digital sphere. And Michael, again, the events on the Capitol showed the enormous impact of social media on democracy today. So what we try to do is identify digital vulnerabilities in various countries. We have a project, for instance, to work in Kenya ahead of the elections next year with the UN Democracy Fund to make sure that the digital environment is conducive to peaceful and legitimate elections. We hope to do this. We hope to work in the Philippines on disinformation. So we have concrete projects on the ground on the digital environment to democracy. That's one area. But more traditionally, we have worked with countries around elections to make sure that the environment for elections is one that is conducive to transparent, legitimate elections. That may mean, for instance, that we get all the political parties together to sign a pledge of good conduct before elections, that they will behave before, during, and after the elections. And we've done this, for instance, in Nigeria and in other countries. So we have very specific interventions with the support, of course, of many other partners in various countries in defense, in particular, of electoral integrity.
So let me ask you a particular question then. How are you received by governments? I mean, when you go in with this kind of agenda, what's their reaction to you?
Well, we always talk to governments before we go in,
Of course,
and most governments are interested in making sure that the environment is peaceful, transparent, and conducive to legitimate elections. Some less than others, I mean, clearly, but we go where we're welcome. Michael, we will not go where we're not welcome, and we work with local actors. We work with civil society, sometimes with business leaders, sometimes with faith-based organizations. So we always have local partners that help us gain this legitimacy on the ground.
I see. Okay, I understand. That makes sense because, as you say, there's no point in pushing at a door which is closed. Yeah. Let's talk about young people. In Western societies, Corinne, I think you probably agree, we seem today much more preoccupied with young people and their views than when I was young, in the 50s, and I'm quite old, and 60s. Older, wiser people held sway. Now, this started to change, as you know, during the 60s and accelerated into the 1970s. At least that is my view of the past and my personal recollections of bygone experiences. But, Corinne, is there a disconnect between young people and those in power today? And if so, is that really such a bad thing? And how and why should young and inexperienced people be better included in our decision-making? What's your view of that?
I think there's a huge disconnect, Michael, actually. And this is because the pace of change has accelerated in the last 20 years.
From when I was young.
Really, yeah. I mean, there wasn't so much social differences in society and technology, surely, between 1940 and 1970.
That's true.
1945 and 1970, or 1980 even. You know, when I was in school. But today, in the last 20 years, the pace of change has accelerated tremendously. And the type of challenges that we are facing, such as climate change, are things that will impact future generations in a way that what the decisions that were taken by policymakers in the 70s or 60s maybe didn't have as much an impact on future generations as the one that are taken now. This is why I think it is absolutely fundamental that we include young people. And let me tell you also that unfortunately, the political class, and not only in the global south, but also in the north, in many countries, is still dominated by older, maybe wiser, essentially men, and they just do not grasp what the reality of young people is and what the challenges of these young people will be, and it's normal. So the young people today are confronted with huge rates of unemployment, with career paths that are not at all as clear as ours were. I mean, and that's in the north, but of course with also the prospect of climate change completely upending their world, frankly. So there is, I think, only less than 5% of parliamentarians who are younger than 35 in the world. So essentially, young people who vote and have a stake in society are essentially represented by their grandfathers in parliament. And as wise as this grandfather might be, he doesn't have, first of all, the older generation has no idea about new technologies, artificial intelligence, and all the challenges that are coming with it. So I think unless we include young people in decision-making, we're going to miss completely many challenges.
So let me ask you a rider to that, Corinne. Practically, how do you help, if that's the right word, maybe I don't mean that to sound patronizing, how do you encourage these young people who, simply because of their years, have a certain immaturity, and that's not a negative, it's just a reality of the arithmetic progression of life, to be more, to make more contribution to the debates and then the policy that governments need to implement in some of these major issues that you talk about today? How do you do that as a foundation?
Well, let me give you a specific example.
Yeah.
We really entered into the field of youth leadership through the angle of the prevention of violent extremism. And Kofi Annan set up this program, which is called Extremely Together program. This is one of our most successful programs until this day.
And what happens? What goes on?
So extremely, what happens is that violent extremists, and we're talking about jihadists, but we're talking also about neo-Nazis in Europe or whatever, are young people, essentially. So they are, and also the victims of terrorism and extremism are often young people. But governments only see them as victims or as terrorists or extremists. They never see them as positive agents of change. And in fact, who is best placed to influence other young people? Young people themselves. So we created this group of leaders, amazing young people from around the world, and some are survivors of terrorist attacks. For instance, we have Bjorn, who was at this Norwegian camp that was attacked by Anders Breivik, the extremist. So some have gone through amazing things, and they dedicate their life to talking to other young people and convincing them not to fall into the trap of violent extremism. And they're very effective because they know what these young people are going through. They understand their mind. They also know, frankly, what are the best communication channels to talk to young people. So this is an example. We need to see these young people as agents of change, not just as, passive victims or people who get drawn into these movements. They actually have a huge contribution to make, and they also can their experience should filter back up to policymakers. And how do you make this? Is the question maybe you're asking, Michael, is how do we make these links so that the experience of these young people and the very innovative ideas trickle up to policymakers?
Exactly,
that's really difficult.
Yeah.
But let me tell you, for instance, we talked about parliaments. We have many organizations in this town that work with various political actors, including the interparliamentary unions. They have a very strong program on young parliamentarians to strengthen them, build their capacity to have more of a voice in their own parliaments. And that's just one example. We would like to, this is just an idea that we're trying to develop as a project, we would like to ensure more contribution of young people to multilateral decision-making fora like the UN. This is going to be tricky, but we have a project for that. And if we had more time, I would get into it. But Michael, this is essential. For me, this is number one priority.
No, we have time. I'm just looking at my stopwatch, not to put you off, Corinne, but we do have time. Because let me ask you another question in that same vein. Is there evidence that these young people, and I guess when you say young people, these are people in their 20s who are coming through university, that they do continue in some kind of political activity as they grow older? I don't mean political in the sort of politics sense, but I'm political in the sense of being active within the polis, within the groups of people that they stay in, or do they just sort of dip in when they're young and then check out as they get to the end of their 20s into their 30s? I mean, what's been your experience of that?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, what we are seeing, in fact, is that young people are withdrawing from traditional political institutions, political parties. We see that their participation in the vote is decreasing as well. And that's very worrying. So they're choosing to have their political impact in the streets. I mean, Greta Thunberg, and for instance, on climate change, we saw Black Lives Matters. We saw lots of these movements. They're choosing to act in the street. But Kofi Annan himself always said that cannot replace the vote. Okay, so what we want is find a way to teach institutions to bring these young people back in, because you're right, they have lost faith in many of our democratic institutions, and that's also why democracy is in retreat, because they've seen that democracy doesn't always deliver for everybody.
That's true. Last question, Corinne. We hear a lot about international Geneva these days. You're based here in the heart of what I call UN country, no more than 5 minutes walk from the gates, the Palais des Nations, the United Nations. Does it matter to the foundation that it is based in Geneva? What are its links to international Geneva and the ecosystem surrounding it?
It matters enormously, Michael, and it's not by chance that Kofi Annan decided decided to establish his foundation here. The ecosystem is so vibrant, so rich, that on every single issue that we deal with or every single project that we start, we know we can find partners locally. We work on prevention of violent extremism. We work with GSURF, which is just down the street, and which is the Global Community and Engagement Resilience Fund, which deals with prevention of violence extremism. We work with Interpeace. We work with the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. We work with Inter-Parliamentary Union, with Telecommunication Union. For instance, let me give you a very basic example. We were looking for mentors to help some of our young change makers. Here, there's an organization of former retired civil servants. It's called Grace Cells. All these former UN people, experts in all kinds of issues, that have retired here and have this incredible wealth of knowledge and expertise and network. And we were able to find mentors through this organization because it's just so rich, the ecosystem here. So it matters that we're here enormously.
Thank you very much, Corinne. That's great. Thanks for answering all my questions so completely and casting invaluable light on some of the things that I needed to know more about. My guest today has been Corinne Momal-Vanian, Executive Director of the Kofi Annan Foundation, based here in Geneva. Corinne, thanks for inviting me in.
Thanks, Michael. Pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you for listening. Please share the show with those around you, and if you have any questions or feedback, write to me at contact@mackays.ch. I promise that I will reply to you.